Hello viewers, welcome to this edition of Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, here on Indus News. In this first segment, we're going to discuss Charlie Hebdo as well as other such incidences across Europe. Now, Charlie Hebdo, as we know right now, there is a trial going on about accomplices to that horrible attack on that magazine not too long ago, a number of years ago. Nevertheless, putting that to aside, and of course no one here as a fine print will justify any such attack, we do want to discuss the reprinting of the caricatures of Prophet Muhammad as well as anti-Islam protests in places like Norway, as well as Sweden also, simply from the viewpoint of harmony and religious tolerance and just acceptance overall. Because there is, of course, the argument on one side that President Macron of France has made about freedom of expression, freedom of speech. But on the other side, we do have, as is legitimate and completely right, limits, as there should be, on hate speech, such as anti-Semitism, which would be unacceptable to any of us, as again, it should be. So no one, again, is asking for other religions or faiths or ethnicities to also be offended purposefully, but to see this, again, within that light of possible double standards, if that's the right word, or whatever other terms of such kinds that we may use. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Patrick Weil, who is a research professor at the University of Paris 1 Sorbonne. He's joining us now from the French capital. Joining us from London is Jonas Otterbeck, who is a professor at the Cahn University, the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. Jonas and Patrick, thank you both for your time today. Patrick, let me start with you. As I said, President Macron has said that he cannot condemn the reprinting of the caricatures of Prophet Muhammad. But then we do have other cases in France, for example, of Dieudonné, the comedian, as you well know, and his anti-Semitism, which again is legitimately worrying and unacceptable. But if that can be seen as hate speech, why can anti-Islam cartoons not be seen as hate speech as well?
That is a very important question you are raising. The French law distinguished between the right to criticize every opinion, every god, every prophet, every religion as a right of opinion, but does not accept hate speech against person, against Jews, as the comedian you are mentioning have done, but also against Muslims. Let me give you the cases of a very iconic star of the old time called Brigitte Bardot, who has been condemned 5 times for Islamophobic or anti-Muslim speeches by the French court, or most recently by a racist anti-Muslim intellectual, I would say, or journalist, Éric Zemmour, who has been also condemned by the court. So the court and the French law is making, since a long time, a big difference between the critique of religion that comes from the French Revolution, from Voltaire, who was criticizing the Catholic Church before the French Revolution, and the attack against persons that are not tolerated by the French law.
All right, Jonas, what are your thoughts on that? Because again, I know that this is sensitive in the sense that, of course, no one wants to completely impede anyone's free speech. That is important. Debate is important. All of the above is important, but again, in a respectful atmosphere, isn't it?
Well, I think that the obvious thing is that since the law, even in Scandinavia, because we mentioned some of the Scandinavian countries, is structured very similar and inspired actually by the French law, this gives groups from the right-wing or the ultra-right-wing groups a vehicle to express their hatred by criticizing Islam. So they find a loophole, putting everyone else in a position where they either will have to accept or infringe on their freedom of speech, or force them to go into much more complex arguments about contextualization, about audiences, about speech acts, where the critique has the function of hate speech. So it's a kind of political economy of hate. If you want to express your hate and do not want to be convicted of hate speech, attacking a religion is a legal and smart way of doing it.
Patrick, I wonder what your thoughts are about just harmony, right, and integration and tolerance amongst different faiths and ethnicities throughout France when it happens, when these sorts of things happen, right? Because it's not like this is the only offensive things that Charlie Hebdo has done, and that's fine, right? Because Charlie Hebdo, as its raison d'etre, is a magazine which is meant to be satire and is meant to, in some ways, be offensive. I mean, it even spoke about Alan Kurdi, that child who died, the migrant child, the asylum seeker child who was killed on that beach. It even spoke about that child as somebody who may have grown up to be a terrorist, I believe, is what the connotation was during that cartoon. But I wonder what you think about the kind of effect that this has on society, right? I mean, we can keep arguing free speech, but then this does affect how people live side by side.
But I think there is so much to do to fight discrimination Muslims are facing in my country. And the first discrimination they are facing is not being Muslim, because even the most racist people recognize and attack them for being Muslim. What they don't recognize in them is their right to be citizen. And it is for example, my fight is about that. And also the right to be treated equally as citizen, not to be over controlled by the French police in the street, stop and frisk. You have so many cases occurring of that. And that is the fight for a full citizenship. It's not about religion, it's about citizenship, where discrimination occurs the most.
This is not, of course, just limited to France, is it? I mean, we've had, the desecration of the Quran, if I may use that term, desecration in Norway and Sweden as well. And I believe there's also a Danish politician as well who's going around, I believe, his own country and other countries in Europe, giving anti-Islam speeches, anti-Muslim speeches also, even though there is a counter movement against him. Why is this sort of sentiment spreading? Is it down to the refugee crisis which Europe went through not too long ago? Is that the root cause, do you think?
That's an older course, and you can find populist parties already in the 1990s picking up on the Muslim critique and the Islam critique thread. First, they sort of attacked Muslims, and they got wise, starting to attack Islam instead. But the Quran desecrations that are going on, it should be understood in the context that Pat is touching upon. I mean, if you look at only Sweden, which is a rather nice country to live in many ways, there are about 10 to 15 serious attacks to the few mosques that there are, like 200 mosques or something like that, every year. And 45% of the responsible of mosques said that during 2017, their mosque was attacked or threatened at one stage or another. And that would include people sort of writing a swastika on the wall or something like that, but also arson, even though that would be sort of the fewer attacks, but 45%. And I wrote an article today in one of the local papers in Sweden urging politicians to see not this as an isolated event, but to see it in context, the context of citizenship, the context of discrimination, and the context of ongoing vandalism on Muslim interests.
Patrick, as you've spoken, Pat, about the issue of citizenship, tell us if you can expand on that for us a bit more, because this then means that in some ways that French society has not accepted Muslims as equal citizens. I mean, that's worrying, because Muslims, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, have been in France for a significant number of years now.
In fact, there was Muslim in France since Algeria was declared full French territory is from 1848 to 1962. And in fact, the big problem is that the French are not taught and don't know the history of the French Empire. And they don't know the political dimension, the citizenship dimension, and the history of their compatriots who have moved from the empire to France and have a part of French history in their own ancestors. And that part of the French history is not known. And to fight discrimination, one of the things I am doing with an NGO I am running, which is called Library Without Borders, we create programs where the kids are asking to elderly people, to grandparents, not to talk about religion, but to talk about history. What are the part of history they are being traumatized by, or they have the memory of? And of course, it's often about the trauma of immigration, the difficulty of changing territory and cities, etc., across their life. And that is the way to consider these compatriots as real compatriots, to put them in a historical path and not in their religion.
Jonas, if we're having this issue of citizenship, right, where does this then end? Because we seem to be having, as we well know, throughout the world, in fact, ever more right-wing movements, right? Except in, some specific countries, but even in places like Canada, which are very multicultural, we have a right-wing movement growing there too. Is that now the pattern for the foreseeable future?
Well, citizenship is an interesting thing because let's separate it between a formal citizenship and an active citizenship. And I think that it's only a small minority in different European countries that are prepared to say that Muslims, for example, are not worthy of full citizenship in a state. That is the formal citizenship. That is the document. But when Muslims are active citizens, taking part in politics, taking part as intellectuals in public debate, not only then entering into a country as refugees, possibly in a socioeconomic position that is lower than general standard, taking the work that in the industry, in the service sector, but actually say that, well, I'm a citizen and I want to be active and I want my ideas to be formulated in public. Then there is a heightened resistance because then people meet the consequences of a public formulated religion in a way that has not been formulated before. And that is a good thing in a way because a society needs discussion. So some people, of course, they manage this. They manage to take this head on. They manage to invite and disagree and make something productive out of that. Other people feel threatened by it.
Yeah. All right, we'll have to leave those no word, but we sincerely appreciate both Jonas and Patrick for their time and for this wonderful discussion. This issue of citizenship as possibly the root cause of these sorts of tensions and the sort of Islamophobic sentiments that are out there, and long-standing ones, mind you, as both of our guests have pointed out in their respective countries, be it Paris or Sweden. Nevertheless, it's worrying, is it not? Because we do then have also, as Patrick there said, this in my opinion at least, this is odd differences between what then constitutes hate speech and what does not. I mean, caricatures of Prophet Muhammad are okay, according to the French president. Anti-Semitism is not, and it should not be, of course. We're not arguing for hatred towards any faith. But then if hatred towards one faith and one faith's, followers is wrong, then why is that not applied to every ethnicity and faith as well around the world, including Muslims and others who are living in France, Sweden, Norway, or elsewhere, anywhere in the world? That needs to be dealt with for us to really have harmonious societies where everyone can live side by side, and of course, for the betterment of everybody as well. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, we know that the United States has had issues with the International Criminal Court's investigation into alleged war crimes that its forces may have committed in places like Afghanistan. And it has gone after the ICC for a number of years now, ever since even the era of George W. Bush, I believe. Nevertheless, at this point in time, we have now the U.S. going aggressively against two ICC officials, i.e. the chief prosecutor and the ICC head of jurisdiction, complementary and cooperation Investigation Division, sanctioning them directly. And it has said, Pompeo has directly said, that anybody who helps the ICC, i.e. ICC employees themselves, within this investigation into U.S. forces activities in Afghanistan or elsewhere around the world vis-a-vis war crimes may very well be sanctioned as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Thomas Pogge, who is a Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs and is founding director of the Global Justice Program at Yale. He's joining us now from New Haven, Connecticut. Joining us from Kabul, Afghanistan, is Victoria Fontan, who is a professor of peace and conflict studies at the American University of Afghanistan. Victoria and Thomas, thank you both for your time today. Thomas, let me start with you. What do you make of the sanctioning of ICC officials? Of course, the ICC understandably has condemned this. So has, the Dutch government as well as the EU.
Yeah, so I think that first we should stress that having something like the ICC around is a very important institution, which we need in order to make sure that there are uniform standards applied in enforcing crimes against humanity, laws, and so on. And so it's very important that we defend the International Criminal Court. Secondly, obviously, the United States is, under existing international law, free not to join the International Criminal Court and has chosen to do that, as basically to stay outside. But what they are now doing goes way beyond that. They are interfering with the activities of the International Criminal Court, even in countries that have ratified, like Afghanistan, for example. And they are targeting individual officials as individuals. So they're freezing the assets, for example, of these two people. And they're also prohibiting people like myself, for example, from interacting with these people. I am not allowed, as a U.S. permanent resident, to donate any money to these two officials or to receive any funds from them. And that, I think, goes way beyond. This is action that is normally reserved for foreign criminals that are not sufficiently sanctioned by their own countries. So the U.S. normally uses these kinds of mechanisms to sanction terrorists. And using these mechanisms against officials who are just doing their job and doing a job to try to improve the behavior of militaries and intelligence agencies in the world, I think, is a very bad precedent.
Right. So then what precedent is being set, Thomas? Because, to many people, of course, as you well know, this would look like the U.S. sees itself as above the law in some ways. And of course, as you correctly there said, it certainly is the prerogative of the U.S. whether or not it accepts the mandate of the ICC as it has declared it does not. But nevertheless, if just an investigation offends it so much and it says, as Pompeo has said, we will do whatever we can to protect our forces from this unfair, investigation, that just means that, now it's almost like a free-for-all, doesn't it?
And also the United States is internationalizing it. It's not just saying that we keep our country outside of the ICC, but it's saying we keep our personnel and our government outside of the ICC internationally. So we are free to do anything, anywhere, at any time, break any law, torture anybody we like, anywhere on earth. And that, I think, is an intolerable resistance to the very idea of having a uniform standard international law, having certain basic human rights that are investigated by an impartial agency.
All right, Victoria, what are your thoughts on this, from your vantage point there? Because one would think that, for a country like Afghanistan or even Iraq, wherever the U.S. may be involved or any other country may be involved and which has gone through upheaval and civil war or war from the outside in, et cetera, that you need to have, accountability to be able to have the people of that country feel like, okay, their lives mattered. If there was abuse towards them, that matters to the international community, right?
Absolutely. Afghan lives matter. And I think that this is at the core of what we are looking at with regards to this particular case. As you know, negotiations are taking place at the moment between the Taliban and the United States. And neither parties actually wants the rights of victims to be recognized in any of the intra-Afghan dialogues or in any of the peace talks that are taking place as a result of the deal that was signed between the US and the Taliban last February. So from the perspective of what's happening in Kabul right now, as you know, this is one of the deadliest conflicts in the world. There's been more than 3,458 casualties since the beginning of 2020 onwards. And so these particular sanctions are seen by the population of Afghanistan and many observers as an act of coercion in order to ensure that there is actually no rights of victims being recognized as part of those ongoing talks. And so this is part of a wide spectrum of, I would say, intimidations against human rights activists. Since the beginning of 2020, there's been targeted killings at one end, and now we see sanctions. And so from the perspective of human rights, it's a wide array of I would say, intimidations, and this is perceived as such on the ground.
Thomas, from a vantage point, do you think that in the U.S. eyes that Afghan lives matter? I mean, is that the message being given out that they don't matter?
That is certainly the message that's given out, but it's not just Afghan lives. It's any lives anywhere on earth that don't matter if the United States decides unilaterally in its own wisdom that they will ruin these lives, right? The U.S. is conducting drone strikes all over the world and holds itself free to do so. And it's basically, its message to the world is that we can kill any person anywhere, we can torture any person anywhere. We do not owe a justification for that or any kind of accounting for that. And anybody who tries to force such an accounting upon us will not only not be cooperated with by us, but will be personally sanctioned and personally penalized by having their bank account confiscated and having their ties with other people disrupted. So it's really a full-fledged attack on the very idea of international law, of an impartial agency that investigates different countries by uniform standards.
So, Victoria, what kind of an effect does this have on the ground in Afghanistan? Are Afghans following this ICC case? Is this important to them?
Yes, they are. There's been 699 referrals to the ICC by Afghan individuals since the pretrial chambers started the idea of a possible investigation into alleged human rights abuses in Afghanistan. And so basically there's a lot of focus on the ground at any impunity that might be the result of the incoming peace deal. And so from the perspective of what I hear among human rights activists in Afghanistan, it is a very serious situation. And from their perspective, they see that if there is no mention of victims in the peace talks and in some of the legal ramifications of those peace talks, then there would be no buy-in for any sustainable peace in Afghanistan in the years to come. So it is a very important issue that has to be seen as such internationally as well.
Yeah, because, you know, this investigation, Victoria, is not just, of course, into U.S. forces, right? It's also into Afghan forces as well as the Taliban themselves also. I mean, in that sense, this is all encompassing. So it's not as if it's just targeting, you know, only the United States, right? Do you think that the Afghan government currently is supporting this? I mean, in your opinion, are they also possibly, do you think, creating obstacles behind the scenes?
Of course, all parties to the conflict have actually been against this investigation of the ICC, because the ICC is investigating war crimes allegedly perpetrated by the United States forces in Afghanistan and war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Taliban and the Afghan government also for war crimes. So all of them are, as we say in French, in the same bag, and none of those parties actually want any investigation to take place or any accountability to be held with regards to those alleged war crimes.
All right, so then before you go, Victoria, I wanted to ask as a final comment then, what kind of ramifications does this have now, just internationally, right? Because, I mean, certainly from your viewpoint, I'm sure you can understand on the ground the kind of ramifications this has, but then the U.S. has been involved in places like Iraq too, it's involved even currently right now in places in Syria. NATO has been involved in Libya. I mean, the list is really endless. So if we have this kind of lack of accountability, lack of worth given to the lives in those respective countries, what does that then mean going forward?
Well, what it means is what my colleague said earlier, that anybody can be killed, tortured, or any human rights can be trampled upon by the United States and other countries that are not signatories to the Rome Statute in the world. So that's the United States, that's Russia. So it is really opening the way for other countries to misbehave as well in those conflicts that you mentioned, such as Syria or other conflicts that might take place. So this is a really grave precedent, an attack on the rule of law and on judicial independence and international human rights law.
Very well heard that, but we sincerely appreciate both of our guests for their expert insight. That was Victoria, who is speaking to us from Kabul, as well as Thomas, who is speaking to us this morning from New Haven in Connecticut. Now, as both of our guests are mentioned, this does set a dangerous precedent, does it not, about the value of human life in different countries around the world. Why should the value of an Afghan life not be enough for the U.S. to be pushed to investigate, or for the international community, in fact, to be allowed to investigate U.S. crimes, alleged crimes, again, against them? That would need to be proven in a proper court of law, international court of law, that is. Sure, yes, as Thomas there had mentioned, the U.S. has the right not to respect the mandate of the ICC, as it has chosen to do ever since George W. Bush. But is that right? Why should the U.S. be above international law in this case? And then on the other side, of course, we have the Taliban. We have the Afghan government also under investigation in this case. So it's not like it's just the U.S. which should feel targeted, but all parties are being targeted, as they should. And if any of them have committed war crimes, they should be held accountable. How else are we expecting peace to come to Afghanistan or any other country around the world? If we don't value human life or just the abuse that people may have suffered, then what are we really expecting to happen going forward? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, 7 years after Edward Snowden blew the whistle on mass surveillance of Americans' telephone records through the National Security Agency, the NSA, an appeals court has now found that the program, the NSA program that is, of mass surveillance was unlawful, and that intelligence leaders at the time, in fact, lied about it and have lied about it ever since, saying that this has, in fact, defended the U.S. from attacks of some sort, even though they can only really cite one case, apparently, in all these years of this mass surveillance program. Now, understandably, of course, Snowden himself, this is a vindication of the work that he has done by blowing the whistle on this issue. Let's discuss all of this a bit further with our guests who are joining us now. We're now joined this morning from Syracuse, New York, by William C. Banks, who's an emeritus professor of law and public administration, as well as international affairs at Syracuse University College of Law. And joining us from Brooklyn, New York, is Albert Fox Cahn, who is the founder of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. Albert and William, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. William, let me start with you. Is this vindication for Snowden?
Well, it's a small piece of what Snowden revealed at the time, and of course, I think this information would have come to light with or without Snowden. Maybe not at that moment, but we have to remember that Snowden also leaked a great deal of additional information, some of which actually did harm, not just to the United States, but to individuals who are working in the field. So you don't want to paint a broad brush, I think, when talking about Snowden's leaks.
Understandable. Albert, thoughts on that? Certainly, I mean, of course, there's no complete black and white here. I'm sure there's a lot of gray area.
I think it's really important to start to see the courts pushing back on the sort of unlawful mass data collection that has been, so prominent in the U.S. for nearly 20 years now. I mean, having this ruling from the Ninth Circuit, having a federal appellate court, strike down this sort of mass data collection, it's really a milestone in the broader fight to try to eliminate this sort of illegal mass data collection. But it's just one part of that broader infrastructure of mass surveillance, just as William was saying.
So then, Will, obviously the goal of all this mass surveillance as sold to the public and the rest of us around the world is to keep, the homeland safe, to keep Americans safe. Just in that regard, do you think it was necessary?
There's very little evidence that this program, it was the so-called call data records program, was not very significant at all in terms of assuring the security of the United States. Your viewers should understand that this was not about surveillance of individual persons listening in on conversations. This was about collecting the records of the communications that individuals had. The numbers dialed, the to and the from, the location. Of course, a lot can be derived from that information, but it's not the content of the communications that was being collected. And there's very little indication that over the period of years when the program was in place that it actually benefited the United States. And I think officials inside the Obama administration 5 years ago realized that, and essentially after Snowden had revealed the existence of it, began to walk away from the program and actually tore it apart, decimated it, before the court had finally declared it unconstitutional. The court that we're talking about now, the decision out of California and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, is looking back at a prosecution and series of convictions that occurred years ago. So we're really looking at history here. The program doesn't exist as we know it today.
Albert, I wonder, though, once it's out of the Pandora's box, right? Once they've opened the Pandora's box, is it as simple as just saying, we're shutting down this program? I mean, can we trust the U.S. when it says that?
Well, I think when it comes to mass surveillance, we always have to verify the claims being made by the government when they are rolling back some of these mass surveillance programs. But really, I'm hoping that, some of the government agencies that have pushed this sort of mass surveillance for years are starting to realize that it isn't an effective tactic. But more important than that, we see, the courts starting to draw lines here saying that, there are limits to the authorities granted under federal law. And at the state and local level in the United States, we're starting to see similar pushback as well, with both court decisions and local legislation that limits the ability of police departments to engage in some of these mass surveillance practices as well. Because while Edward Snowden revealed a lot about the ways that the NSA and other federal agencies were engaging in these sorts of bulk data collection programs, we also see, police departments like the NYPD engaging in far-reaching mass surveillance programs, which really are completely ineffective, as well as being fundamentally opposed to, the protections that are supposed to be found in the Constitution. I do think that it is possible, even once this technology exists, even once these abusive practices exist, to push them back into the bounds and restraints that are supposed to be in place under our Constitution.
So do you think, William, that we're better placed right now to, in fact, have methods of securing the homeland through surveillance of some sort, I would imagine, at some level, but possibly not this sort of mass surveillance that we're discussing right now, possibly through, community involvement and more interaction with the community, because I would think that the sort of surveillance we're talking about would possibly have targeted some specific communities in the U.S., right? So, instead of working with them, this was sort of keeping an eye on them.
There is a big difference, it's true, between collecting call records and actually conducting surveillance that listens in on conversations or is able to acquire the contents of communications. That's much more intrusive, of course, than collecting the mere existence of a communication between person one and person two, if you listen to the message itself. And historically, the United States laws have done far more to protect the content than the mere existence of the call. But what happened a few years ago, as Albert knows, is that in another court decision called Carpenter, the Supreme Court finally after many decades, recognized that merely because we as Americans give our information to a telecom company, that once it's in their hands, they're not at liberty to then turn that information over to the government. Before that, the so-called third-party doctrine in the U.S. held that once it's in the third-party provider's hands voluntarily, because we sign agreements when we sign up for internet service or telephone service, then it's up to the company's discretion to decide what to do with it. That's no longer the law in the United States, so it's much easier, I think, now for courts to draw lines like they drew in the Ninth Circuit decision this week and then an earlier one in New York. So back to your initial question, it's hard to conduct surveillance on individuals, and it should be done only reluctantly because it's so intrusive of privacy rights. There should be a connection to the need for foreign intelligence information, and that's the usual predicate that has to be demonstrated before that kind of surveillance can be undertaken.
Albert, I want to know what you feel about, we're talking about telephone records here, right? But I wonder what you feel about social media and what kind of what kind of Pandora's box that has opened when it comes to surveillance. Because I think we've all had the kind of experience where we may have been discussing something with our family members or friends with our phones close by, and then suddenly we open up our Facebook accounts and on our newsfeed we have advertisements about that very exact item or object or even destination, if we're talking about a travel destination, pop up. And that all strikes us as odd sometimes, right? Where that level of listening in to our private discussions exists at this point in time, regardless of, what laws may say. What are your thoughts on that?
And, we have to be clear, this sort of surveillance isn't targeting everyone equally. It's feeding into the same sort of racism and bias that is, defined American surveillance practices for generations. We see, particularly Muslim Americans, communities of color, Black organizers in the BLM movement being systematically targeted with these invasive surveillance tools, not because they've done anything wrong, but because those in power are, frightened by their mere identity. And we have this, and so we shouldn't treat this as some sort of neutral program or some sort of just something that exists out there purely for public safety. It really is perpetuating some of the worst injustices that have defined the American legal system throughout its history. And with these newer forms of surveillance, we're only compounding that problem. We're only compounding that bias as we add artificial intelligence, predictive policing, social media analytics, and these other tools which, give government agencies really terrifying levels of power to track all of us at a very low cost, right? Because historically, it would have taken dozens of officers and thousands of dollars a week to track any one suspect over the course of their week, to see who they met with, what they bought, how they spent their time. But now you can do that for pennies. And so police departments and federal agencies are using this invasive level of surveillance to track the movements and the activities of millions and millions of people without any real check, because they can, and because the law has been permissive, and because it's so inexpensive. And while, William's quite right to point to the Carpenter decision, the fact that the Supreme Court is starting to push back on some of this, there's still a lot of these really invasive practices like facial recognition tracking, cell phone geofence data, as well as biometric data, such as, the new requirements for, iris scans and, voice print analysis from immigration officials that allowed our government agencies to track just truly unprecedented numbers of people.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a word, as the clock has gotten the best of us, but we do sincerely appreciate both Albert and William for their time this morning and for putting this all into context for us, right? Because as William there correctly said, Snowden did reveal a lot of information, a significant amount of information, and as part of that information is what this court has ruled upon, and that was the mass surveillance of Americans' telephone records in order to, at least that was the goal that was stated, to keep Americans in fact safe. They were spied upon. But this court has said that was in fact unconstitutional, that was in fact unlawful and illegal, and the intelligence leaders who defended it were not telling the truth, because it hasn't in fact resulted in that many convictions or that many cases of people who were seeking to in any way harm Americans or just the national security of the United States as a whole. What does this then mean going forward? Have we really rolled this program back as the government says, or have we just now moved on to other mass surveillance? As Albert there was mentioning right at the end, different forms of mass surveillance now already exist, which are that much harder to track and understand because these are all new technologies. So those who are taking advantage of this at this point in time, not just in the US, but around the world, know that they can possibly get away with this for now until the rest of us really realize what's going on. But as I said to Albert as well, we know what happens, right? When it comes to social media companies listening in on our conversations, that's how advertisements come up on our news feeds, etc. It's odd to have your conversation listened in on to that extent. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.